Welcome everyone to this great episode. This is probably my favorite episode of This Much I Know, because in this episode, I get to interview my dad. Now you're wondering, why am I interviewing my dad? Well, it turns out my dad actually has quite a history, and a history that I'm hoping he will share with us for the benefit of very specific types of circumstances, which are companies that are going through a hard time and need to effectively restructure. Now, the reason why is because my dad's done quite a bit of restructurings himself, and I'll let him introduce a little bit about himself in a second. But it's always awkward talking about yourself, so I'm going to do some of it for you, Dad. So he's done 11 restructurings to date. His largest one had 17,000 employees. His smallest one had 200 employees. And it's a big breadth of companies and industries as well. I mean, I know you've done oil and gas, and you've done telecoms. So you've done quite a bit of different industries. And I know that within that, you've come up with some lessons, which I know you've shared with many people in the past. And I know that you're working on some product, maybe a book, who knows, that will summarize this. So with that, I want to welcome you to the podcast. As I said, the coolest podcast ever, because I get to interview you. Maybe for the audience, you can share just a little bit more details about yourself and kind of some of the things that you've done.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored to be in your show. I'm, you can see, a little bit more senior, but I started as an electrical engineer, majoring in telecom and computer science, and then went to work. My first job was for a telephone company in a country in Central America. And I started as a field engineer and basically dealing with tons of people as a construction supervisor. And, in a couple of years, in less than 4 years, I was the chief engineer, responsible for all the engineering and construction of the company. And believe it or not, at the age of 28, I was the CEO of the company. This was a 5,000 people company. And, of course, I was probably the youngest of all the senior management team. Most of the members of the senior management team were 20 years older than me. But that was my case. And it was my first case of restructuring without much knowledge. So I say I made many mistakes. But at the end, succeeded in the restructuring. And after that, I went to further schooling. I went to a business school in Boston. And then when I say, well, I think I know about the art of, let me find out a little bit more about the science of restructuring. And so I went for a master's degree and a PhD in industrial engineering and computer science, which basically found that it was relevant in major restructuring. The IT component it seems to be the biggest drawback in major restructuring. In terms of experience, done, as you mentioned, several restructurings. Probably more than 11 when you take a lot of little companies that we included as part of several conglomerates. But it was a marvelous experience. And the idea that I took from the very beginning was I take this restructuring very professionally. Sometimes I have been the CEO. Sometimes I've been an advisor to the CEO. And I take them very professionally, very honest. And I attempt to respect everybody in the process, including the most humble people, because they never have the responsibility for what went wrong in the company. It's leadership who is responsible. So we have to focus on leadership in every single case. The root of the cause of the problem and the solution is leadership. So with that, thank you for inviting me to your show. I'm most happy to comply with your questions.
Yeah, Dad, there's no complying here. You don't have to comply to anything. So I guess one thing what we can do is help define restructuring, because I think anybody who's listening to this, especially early stage founders, are probably wondering, how's anything that I'm going to listen to this episode applicable to a company of 20 people or less? And the original idea behind interviewing was, companies that don't find product market fit very quickly find themselves in a crisis. And so one way of defining restructuring is crisis management, but there's also another angle to it. Now I'm going to ask you to define it for me. But, the idea behind the podcast episode was, you know what if we could apply some of the lessons from restructuring to helping companies that have not managed to make it so far and who know that they're in a crisis have a framework to get through to the other end. So maybe we can start off by definitions. So how do you define a company that needs restructuring, and what are the usual sources of company needing to restructure?
The basic definition of restructuring is when you stop creating value, or you're no longer in the possible manner to create value. So that's I would say, the simplest definition. In the case of startups, of course, when you probably lose the potential of that value creation, and that is something that you need to address very quickly. So that is, I would say, in a summary, in a nutshell, the definition of when restructuring is required.
So if that's when a restructuring is required, what are the top actions you need to take as a CEO in a restructuring? Like, that maybe break down the 5 parts that make up a restructuring.
Well, yes, to a great extent, it depends on the restructuring itself. As every restructuring is a mission impossible, like the movie, process. And you have to basically identify and assess what are the root causes of the problem, clearly nail it down. And in that process, you need to communicate, regardless of the size of the organization, large or small. You need to communicate to all the key stakeholders. Of course, key stakeholders are the employees, and not only the one that report to you directly, but all the rest of the staff. So, and where that is probably one of the major sources of information. They will, if you act honestly and behave honestly, they will give you the frank answers to your questions. But also your potential customers and investors, they will also help you understand, what are the root causes of the problem. And with that, you basically have to understand, is it a people problem? Is it a process problem? Is it a technology problem? Is it a product market fit problem? Is it a cultural problem? Depending on the nature of the problem, you have to create a plan and prioritize what are you going to do about it. And this you have to, as I said, from the very beginning, you need to be a very good communicator. You need to communicate. It doesn't mean that you need to talk a lot. Now, you need to listen a lot. Okay, and listening is a key ingredient in this process. Next, basically, you need to assess the quality of the team. Determine if the team that you have is really the team that will basically deliver what you want to achieve at the end. If you are a startup, is this a team that will really accompany you to achieve the quantum leap that you want to achieve, that you want to have in mind? And if not, you have to make the hard decisions very quickly. And what I mean very quickly is very quickly. You don't have time. With that, once you have the root cause of the problem, you have the priority, you have the people, you basically have identified the business operating model that you're going to do in order to go from where you are to where you need to be. What is the business operating model at the end of the game? What is the business that you're going to be running? You put together a transformation plan. But one key ingredient of that transformation plan is a massively transformation purpose. What are you going to do radically to transform the business? And this applies to large companies or small companies. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Once you have done this,
can you give an example of a transformational purpose?
Of course. Sometimes in an organization, let's say, for instance, an ongoing business. I'm going to bring you an example that might not be necessarily applicable to you, but you can extend the concept to your most of your audience. Let's say a company finds in a radical situation where the prices of the products happened that it drops 90%. And this happened to a company, in fact, in Europe. Prices dropped 90%, and suddenly the company is a major crisis. And what they did is transform, it was in the oil and gas business, and transform its operating model basically to transition it to green energy totally on a period of time. And this is a case that is is a business case of a major radical transformation, because everything that you were doing in the past, you say, I'm no longer going to do it. And I'm going to implement a new operating model. I'm going to bring new people in. This is going to be, the whole ecosystem is going to change. And the company was successful in transforming itself, and now it's a public company. Right? Okay, so this is a company that used to happen, it's a company in Denmark. But anyway, it applies to every kind of companies. And depending on the situation of why you need to restructure, this is the premise.
Great. So we did the identification assessment of the root cause of the problem. We did assessment of the quality of your team. We went through the definition articulation of the transformational purpose for you and your team. What's next?
Well, you need to communicate the plan, and then you have to execute. And execute is, it's a lot of perspiration, because you need to commit. And this, you have to have a very motivated team. You have to have everybody on board. Everybody has to participate in the creation of the plan, because everybody has to feel the ownership part of the plan. Otherwise, you will never achieve it. And that applies for small companies, big companies, every size of company. You have to have everybody on board.
Mm. And how do you, when you're going through the identification of the assessment of the root cause, how do you know you're not the problem? I mean, a lot of founders are first-time CEOs, first-time leaders. How do they determine whether, am I the problem? Am I the reason why we didn't raise money? Am I the reason why people quit? How do you know?
Well, it's a very relevant question, and it applies for the startups, or applies for large companies too, because we are all human beings. But in order for you to succeed, you need to be honest and transparent. And one way of doing it is achieving, basically securing feedback. And you need to secure feedback from people inside the company and people outside the company. Outside the company might be potential customers, or might be investors. And inside the company, I would recommend that you ask feedback from the people who are the most critical of your behavior, because if you act honestly, they will give you honest feedback. And the reason for asking this feedback is because you want to improve. It's not because you want to feel bad yourself. No, you say, I think, if you are honest enough, you say, I think I am probably part of the problem. What can I do to fix it? What can I do to improve? And this, you need feedback.
And how do I not create a problem for myself? By if I ask a colleague, I might just actually open up a Pandora's box of arguments. Or if I ask a client, I could lose them if I'm insecure about what I'm doing. How do you prevent that?
Well, you depart from two basic premises. One, you ask the feedback. You say, I'm going to be honest with you, and I want you to be totally honest. Number one. Number two, I want this to improve my own behavior. I want to do it for myself to improve. How can I behave better? How can I do things better? What things I need to do to make this business successful? And what can I do to change it quicker? These are the kind of feedback that you can ask, and people will answer you with, if you go humble and you say, I want this to improve. How can I do this better? How can I? The people will give you honest feedback with no consequences.
Mm. Right. Well, it's probably worth sort of exploring that further with regards to team members that are of maybe you're close to you and to what you're doing. Because I think we were discussing earlier that there's a challenge when you ask people who report to you that sometimes they can be less honest. But maybe you want to comment on maybe who to come to for feedback.
Well, this is something that I have done all my life, even in restructuring cases, because you're not God, you're not owner of all the wisdom in the world. So you need to be asking for feedback. And what I found the most successful is the people who gave you the best feedback is the people who are the most critical of your behavior. And I always identify, assuming that they're honest. You don't want to asking this feedback from a jerk. You want to have somebody who is critical of your idea and give you reasons why they are critical. And this is a feedback that will help you, and not only that, not only helps you be a better leader, but also creates a better working condition. Because if you are the CEO, you have to you have the obligation to provide feedback, but you need to be respectful, and you need to follow the trust between the parties. You cannot just be giving feedback all the time. You don't have to be careful when you provide feedback, but also at the same time you can ask for feedback, and in that way, that exchange creates a culture of trust, and you keep it for yourself, and you act accordingly. And so that creates an environment of trust. And within trust, things, you will find that where you create that culture of trust, there's no fighting. There's no infighting, because people, expose the idea, they give you facts. Based on facts, you make decisions. And the team behaves on that culture of trust. It's able to create what is best for the organization, not necessarily for their own, let's say, kingdom or their own turf, but it is what is best for the organization.
Well, this is a good segue to one of the examples that you were sharing with me about how to drive change in the mindset and drive change in culture. And I think it was a company you were sharing with me that it's a local company to where you are in Mexico right now, an auto parts company. Do you want to maybe share that story?
Well, yes. This might share two cases. One of this company, and maybe another one of a small telecom company. This is a company that was purchased right before the crisis of 2008 by a friend of mine, an auto part company here in Mexico, the subsidiary of a large corporation. And the company in 11 years never made a penny. No, 12 years, sorry. 12 years never made a penny. Never reported a profit. And the reason for that is because they will always send from their parent company in the US all the products that they didn't want to do in the US. So they were always doing, everything that nobody else wanted to do. So that was one of the reasons why the company never reported a profit. So this friend of mine bought it at a distressed value, secured the support from a private equity firm, and in fact, a fund, and was able to acquire it right at the beginning of the crisis. And we agree on a transformation plan, and basically what we aligned from the very beginning. In fact, the new owner and chairman of the company, he invited me to participate in many of the meetings. Is basically communicated to the senior management and middle management of the rest of the organization what we were going to do. The outlines of the plan. We were still perfecting the plan, the outlining of the plan, everything that we were going to do, the period of time, what we were going to do. And on top of that, he announced a 10-point, I would say, cultural value, cultural manual of the things that we're allowed to do and things that we're not allowed to do. Basically, clearly outlining the culture that was going to be required and had to do basically with issues around people. Remember, they had been a subsidiary of a larger corporation, so all the company required was extended procedures, a lot of signatures, a lot of approvals. He said, we're no longer going to need that. This is how we're going to behave. We're going to deal with each case by case, and we're going to be setting the example. We're no longer going to tolerate discrimination. We're not going to. This is a company that had a lot of female personnel. So we're no longer going to tolerate any abuses of any kind. So it was clearly articulated, and this is what we're going to do. And then we had a follow-up meetings with every member of the senior management so that there was a clear understanding of the plan and of the culture that was required. And, this is what we're going to be doing going forward. And this, we did it with every member of the senior management. There was one case of one member of the senior management that decided that he was not going to, he just say, I cannot do it, what you're asking us to do. And that was the case of a CFO. So, on the spot, the chairman of the board say, look, yeah, fine, you're, please pack and leave. And as simple as that, because, your service is no longer required. And I don't want anybody being a roadblock inside the company. And that was communicated to everybody. We told them exactly, he expressed his desire to leave the company. He was not willing to comply with the requirements. And we paid him all his severance. I mean, everything that was due to him. And we brought somebody to take over. As simple as that. And we continue with our program. And one major change that we had to deal with, the company had a very strong union. And, at the beginning, the union decided not to meet. But at the end of the day, we forced them to, meet and tell them. And we told them the plan, exactly everything that we told senior and middle management, we told the union. And this is a culture. This is what we're going to be doing. We're going to keep you informed. We're not going to be asking your permission. This is what we're going to be doing. And at the end of the day, it proved to be a very good move, because then the crisis of 2008 came. It hit us very badly. And in that case, one of the decisions, because we realized that we had limited cash and that we had to conserve the cash for the transformation, we asked the union and we asked all members of the senior and middle management for concession in terms of their wages. We were able to implement, with the approval of the government also, a wage reduction of basically 40% across the board. And that, of course, because the purpose was, how do you preserve cash? And we knew that we were going to get out of this crisis. And we decided, these were well-trained people. There was nothing wrong with the training or the skill, the capabilities. The plan was a nice plan, had all the skill, in order to serve the auto industry, you have to understand it has to be quite, in terms of quality, it has to meet the highest standards of quality. So we say, we're not going to reduce 40% of the headcount and then find out that we need the people to bring them back. Of course, there were a few people who left, but that was minor. So people accepted the 40% headcount, but we told them at the very beginning, once we pass this crisis time, we're going to reinstate the wages. Okay? Believe it or not, a year and a half later, we're back in full mode production, and we're producing at 100%. And not only did we pay back that money, but we gave very, handsome bonuses to the senior and middle management, and also took good care of the people. So I would say it's a clear example of how do you change a culture and how do you deal with difficult circumstances. And because like in every case, even in your cases of small venture startups, things happen. And like the crisis that we have in 2008, we didn't anticipate it, but we had to deal with it. We already had,
Yeah.
And this is it's a clear case of a burning platform example, and I would say burning platform is a case where the example refers to an oil platform in the ocean where there is a fire. If you're in the middle of the ocean in the North Sea, if you jump into the water, of course you freeze and you die. And if you stay in the platform and continue burning, you burn. So you have to take a lot of decisions very quickly. And so this was a case of, in this case in Mexico, where we implemented this, burning platform methodology because we needed a lot of changes very quickly, but had to do mostly the changes that we did in terms of technology and processes were minor. Most of the changes were related with people, culture, the way to do things, the way to deal with customers, the way to deal with suppliers, the way to, basically that part of the business operating model.
Cool. Well, if I had to summarize kind of what the key lessons were from that, I would say that, the transformation comes from the top. So it was the new management that highlighted its 10 key points that would define the culture. Then take very quick action with regards to HR issues where somebody might be having a little kingdom or a little niche that they're like negative and they're preventing this change from happening. Act quickly, fire them quickly. And then think about this transformation in a way especially when there's limited cash runway, as a burning platform, and use that as a way of getting everybody aligned so that you can then do radical things like saying, hey guys, we're going to run out of money. We should all take a 40% salary cut to make through these tough times. And I will honor the promise that I will pay you back if things come back to a good state. And then also lead from the top in the sense that the salary cut also applies to you, because otherwise, well, what's the point of that, right? You lose trust. So I think that those are the lessons that I took from that. And I know that you also had another example you wanted to share about this telecommunications company.
Yeah, this is a case of a company that always, in this case, I was the CEO. So I was hired to be the CEO, the turnaround CEO. And I was given the report from McKinsey, the consulting company, that said that the company had basically 2 years to live. That's exactly what the McKinsey report read. Because competitors were coming to this company had been so far a monopoly. So concession had been granted to competitors. So we had a time horizon of, I would say, 18 months. That was exactly the time horizon that we had. So based on that, I say, well, I took the responsibility, this, again, mission impossible job of transforming a company that had been operating as a government subsidiary. It was, just to give you an idea, the company had 7 unions, okay? So representing every class.
Extra exciting.
Okay, it doesn't mean that in a startup you don't have that. You probably don't have union, but you have turfs, you have kingdoms, little kingdoms. Okay, that of course is the metaphor here. Not only that, but the senior management has a total mistrust. Nobody trusted anybody. I mean, it was a total disarray in terms of trust. The company was, I would say, because it was a monopoly, it had a reasonable, nice P&L. Now, here was the case of a company that had grown up, basically never done any future investment or innovation, where totally the customer was ignored, totally ignored. There was never any feedback from customers. even though there were two reports that were produced every year, which was the voice of the customer and the voice of the employees. From a scale from 0 to 100, the voice of the customer was 18%, and the voice of the employees was 29%. Okay, that gives you an idea of how lousy the employees and the customer felt. So very quickly, we agree on the priority, what the root cause of the problem was. I did, okay, I'm going to do these are the changes that I'm going to be introducing. And in this particular case, the first person that I fired was the lady that was responsible for she was the director of communications. And the reason why I fired her is that because I found that something that I asked her in total trust and confidence, she disclosed it with other people. And I said, look, I cannot allow this to happen. So I fired her on the spot. And, and I say, we're gonna pay you all of your severance, but you no longer have the trust of me. So I cannot have you in the team. And I communicate that to everybody, and it was clear that was part of the principles of culture that I wanted in the organization. But the issue that I had with the company, net management, never communicated with the people. All the communication were always through the 7 unions. So I say, how do you do a transformation without communicating with the people that you lead? So what I did is, of course, I invited the unions. I talked to them. I told them exactly what we were going to do, and I informed them of what we were going to do. I was not asking for their permission. I was informed. I'm going to keep communicating. I'm going to be letting you know the same way that I'm communicating to the employees what we're going to be doing, and I expect your support. Believe it or not, I knew exactly, because before taking the job, I knew that the union used to make a strike there was one strike per month. There was always one strike going on in the union somewhere, but that was a way to keep the management of balance. And I took the job on a 2-year assignment. Just to give you an advance notice, I never had one issue with the union, not one single strike in 2 years. But tell me what I did. In order to get everybody on board, and because one of the first things that came to being requested from me was, okay, we need more space. We're going to be, we need to expand. We're going to need more office space. We need this and this. And I say one case, and I said, I want to share with you, I was trained in Japan, so I have lived the culture of quality. So one thing that comes from lean management is the concept of muda. Muda, translated into English, is waste. And one thing that I'm going to do is we're going to implement a program that is called 3S from the quality management in Japan, which is basically the first step to reduce muda, okay, to reduce waste. The 3S program calls for order, classification, and cleanliness. In English, those are the 3 words. In Japan, it's called 3S plus 1, which is order, cleanliness, and classification. And the plus 1 means continuous improvement. But anyway, we're going to focus on the 3S at this time. And what we did is we brought this to every single director, manager, supervisor, clerk, everybody, everywhere. There was a 3,000 employee company. And believe it or not, in a period of 3 months, we have produced more than 40 trucks of products, of things that were no longer needed. Like, for instance, all computers that no longer was being used, stuff that was not needed, files, all kind of stuff. And there was, for instance, there was one big exchange no longer being used, that we were able to free up 1,400 square meters of a space that was no longer needed. So we created, and believe it or not, people got so enthusiastic about it, they got motivated, and they began to feel it. And through that, and I produced a weekly mail to every employee telling them exactly what the objectives were and how we were doing. what we were doing, what are we doing, and everything has to be consistent with the plan. We were always communicating that, and through that, we engaged communication directly with the employees and got the employees motivated. The union, at one time, the unions came to complain that we were no longer using them to communicate. I tell them, look, I'm copying you every single email that I send to employees. You please feel to communicate to them. Okay? They say, no, you need to communicate to us so that we can communicate to them. I say, I'm the CEO of the company, and they are employees of the company, so I can communicate with them without nobody in the middle. So you please feel free to communicate to them whatever you feel or your opinions. If you disagree, communicate it to them, to me, whoever you want. But this is a team effort, and I want everybody on board. So that was a platform that we created in order to communicate the rest of the methodology on all the changes that we were able to do in the company.
Well, that's another great anecdote, because you cover slightly different things than the first anecdote. And I think it puts a really good picture of a lot of components that define a restructuring. So one of the things that you talked about was this idea of like a culture of mistrust and how to fix that. And if a company got into a bad situation, there's probably brewing mistrust. And sometimes you need to make some very difficult decisions very quickly. And then when you make those decisions, break down communication barriers that were built up. Sometimes in that lead up to that failure, there was a whole bunch of walls that got built up. You need to break them down and bring everybody along in that change. And sometimes as part of that building up, it sounds like there's a lot of waste that can be generated. And that waste in your case was like, stuff. But in a digital startup, it could be like processes, or you had a bad manager and there was a TPS report that somebody needed to do, and you get rid of the TPS reports. If you've not seen the movie The Office, you have no idea what I'm talking about, Dad. So don't worry about that. But it's like, there's a lot of stuff that you can probably get rid of as part of that realignment. But it sounds like two key things. Sounds like one, it has to come from the top. So you can't have, certain management levels opting out of this stuff. And the other thing that it sounds like is that it's frequent communication with everyone. And you have to skip any kind of pretentious level of like hierarchy. So maybe transitioning away from these examples into implementation of these in an ongoing basis. So first of all, what time frame should somebody think about in terms of, okay, fine, they've just listened to this podcast, or like, okay, I get it, I think I know what I'm going to do. What's a reasonable amount of time to like expect change to happen?
Well, you have to consider two basic factors. One, how much money you have. Second, the extent of the changes. Most of the cases that I've been involved had to do, I would say, from 9 to 18 months. Okay, because in sometimes require complex, changes. Like, for instance, in this case of the company in Trinidad and Tobago, it required a major undertaking in terms of infrastructure build out and computers and all the IT that were required to modernize a company. So it takes time and a lot of investment, and we needed to secure the funding to finance all this capital investment. But in the case of, for instance, the other case of the Mexican auto part company, the changes that were focused particularly on culture and people, we were able to implement those in very relatively short period of time. I would say if you went from day one and you went 6 months later, the culture was totally different, but a radical change. And that it was because we had no more money. That was the time horizon that we had for that. And we had the beauty that the company was a tier 1 supplier to the auto industry. So the processes and the infrastructure was of good quality. So it had to do mostly around people, culture, strategy, business operating model, which is something that you can fix relatively quickly. And so that's basically the parameters of the time horizon on which you draft a plan, and here again, be prepared for major contingencies. And this is part of the plan is risk assessment. It doesn't mean a committee or it just someone sometimes the CEO himself say, look, what are the risks? What, how do I deal with this risk, and how do I overcome and get around them, because I need to incorporate them into my cash flow.
All right. Well, the last question, I think this kind of wraps up all the concepts really well. And you alluded to this earlier when you were talking about 3S's plus one, which is this idea of migration from this burning platform to something more sustainable. So walk us through, because a crisis can sometimes divide people, but many times it unites people. But then keeping that momentum, like when the crisis is mostly resolved, keeping that drive, how do you build from that?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that you cannot keep the crisis management style forever. People will burn out. You cannot be working extensive hours for an indefinite period of time. So you have to put an end to that. And you have to have that in mind and communicate when do you expect that to happen. Okay? It doesn't mean that you are committed to that date, but you have to create expectation, and you have to make every single effort to meet that date. Now, before you reach that date, you have to put in a plan in place to transition from the burning platform methodology into something that creates value long term and keeps the exponential growth that you want. And all the benefits of innovation, all the benefits of continuous improvement, all the benefits that are associated with long-term venture to survive and to succeed. To have the kind of growth that you're expecting, assuming that it is the digital world, if it is an exponential growth, you have to have that in mind. And in order to do that, you have to put the foundation from the very beginning, and there was a period of time, and you have to have that in stages. Like, for instance, the 3S plus one. For instance, you want to empower people, and if you want to create innovation, the best way to do it is create a program of continuous improvement. Okay, how do you go about creating a program of continuous improvement? Of course, it all, and this, of course, for us is, it's kind of, when you talk agile, continuous improvement, it sounds like terms, but you have to understand the context where they come from. In Japan, and this is something that people learn a lot in a school, at home, like the 3S program is implemented at home. This is not something that you teach at college level. No, this is something part of the DNA, part of the culture. So a lot of things that you need to incorporate is, for instance, this program of continuous improvement. It's something that you need to start like at senior level. You have to create your improvement teams at senior level, and then middle management, and then at lower level, you go back to what used to be called the Kaizen circles. Okay, the continuous improvement circles. Now, the Western version of that is what we call agile. Okay, and of course, it's a methodology in itself. But if you don't have senior management commitment and understanding of the methodology, agile doesn't work. In my experience, and I have seen companies all over the world that have attempted to implement agile only at the floor level without senior and middle management involved or committed or understanding of what the methodology means. And it's a total failure. So you have to have across the company culture to foster this kind of innovation. And once you are able to do that, then you will see the benefits that the continuous improvement and trust can create in terms of innovation, in terms of cost reduction, in terms of revenue, new revenue sources. This is a model that is never ending because it feeds in itself, and it creates wealth, and it creates economic value because of the dialogue, the trust dialogue that exists at all levels of the organization, everybody contributing. with the ecosystem, not only within the company, but also with the ecosystem. You ask feedback and, copy, steal, do whatever from the ecosystem in order to assimilate into organization. The same thing, you depart from a culture of scarcity into a culture of abundance, where you share some of the benefits that you are having with the rest of the ecosystem so that it creates more value and you can help yourself and create more growth and have a larger ecosystem. And of course that brings some complex issues, but that's part of the the benefits of creating these cultures. And that you can sustain that as basically, as Colin says, on creating something to last. And that's basically the lessons that I would learn from, that I would imply from the crisis mode that you have at the beginning until you transition to a larger scale and longer time company.
No, that's an excellent point to end on, Dad. Basically, it's once the major change has been completed, you need to very quickly establish the habit of continuous improvement across every member of the team. It's like, and to some extent, delegate or empower. Really, I think you used the word empower. Is empower them to come up with ways of continuously improving their function downwards, sideways, upwards, everywhere. It sounds like, including external with suppliers and everything.
At the end of the game, is creating value everywhere you can.
Yeah.
The concept is, how do you embed the concept of creating value? Great.
Well, thanks, Dad. I know that we could probably go through 500 other stories, because I know you've had tons of fun and exciting stories throughout your life. And I'll share your socials and everything on the show notes. But thanks for joining us on this episode. And till next time, guys.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.